So, there's something kind of fake about the five core principles, at least in as much as they're not an original part of this tradition and they're not a part of the majority of its history. So when we think Lasallian and immediately come up with the core principles, we're performing a kind of act that, depending on how we do it, can capture the brothers or miss them entirely. So if they just remain five principles, I would argue they remain kind of false. They remain a kind of checklist that we can use to appear Lasallian. If they become something living, I would argue, then it seems to me then that it's more probable you're actually a part of the Lasallian tradition. It's entirely understandable why these core principles exist. The brothers want to make sense of themselves in the modern world to people who mostly haven't been exposed to the brothers. And one handhold we can have is a summary of principles. It's a quick way to start to try to get into a mindset. My question is more sort of what we've got in the last line of what Brother Charles read. How do we connect the modern expression of the mission with the work and words of the founder? And I think that's important because the Lasallian tradition is a life. It's about a life, de La Salle, but it becomes a form of life. So if we're gonna live it, we have to ask what makes it alive, what animates it. And so I was trying to think of how is it that I can give us a picture of this. And I think that religious or not, telling stories from De La Salle's life is a way to start bringing these things alive. So I have a couple of examples, one from De La Salle's life and another from the history of the brothers. So in his meditations for retreat for the brothers, as they take a break from teaching and get ready to teach again, you need to breathe, collect yourself. He starts off at the very beginning by saying, well, he basically tells the story of why the brothers were founded. And he saw children in the streets of the city wandering alone, without education, and he even compares them to animals, not because he thinks they're animals, but because he thinks that they've been dehumanized through neglect. And De La Salle responds by wanting to give them an education, not only so they have new opportunities, but primarily so that they can perhaps meet God, think about God. And these are connected things for De La Salle. So one question we might ask ourselves from this story is, how do we shape other people and ourselves into the kind of people who would look on others and see them as capable of the dignity that De La Salle clearly sees in these children? How do I become a person who's able to creatively respond to the problems in front of me? How do I have the creativity that allows my faith, whatever it is, to inform the decisions I make? We see this again in the 1930s. I was reading about Spanish Civil War, and some brothers were killed because they wouldn't stop teaching children about religion, which had been outlawed, and they wouldn't stop taking children to Mass. In other words, they saw that part of the freedom of being human means taking advantage of the freedom to search for God. And they died for that. To translate these relatively old principles into our era requires making them relevant, but at the same time maintaining the strangeness of the founder himself. So we have to translate what's alien to us as well and keep that. It's often the theological that's difficult for us. The God stuff, the Jesus thing. And it's okay for that to be a challenge, but it has to continue to be a challenge. Because De La Salle looked upon children and saw them as worthy of learning because they're worthy of God. And so we have to ask ourselves, how is it that we, as faculty and staff and students, act something like that too? I'll end there. Thank you.